Talking business, nothing but talk.
This is the Coast Business Radio Podcast.
Brian Marlow is the Executive Director for the Australian Taxpayers Alliance. The Alliance is an activist and advocacy organisation committed to representing the everyday Australian taxpayer. Through grassroots campaigning, they oppose overregulation, wasteful spending and burdensome taxes. Their mission is to transform our nation and build a better, freer Australia. Brian, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, the Australian Taxpayers Alliance has been critical of the federal government's approach to COVID-19. What should they have done better to contain the virus and for the economy?
I think in terms of containment, some of the steps they put in were probably just a little bit too late. They were still a lot earlier than what we've seen in other countries, so we can't really criticise them too heavily in terms of the containment. The biggest issue is the economic response, though. They seem to be employing a model of just printing money, completely shutting down the economy, no questions asked, and really putting small businesses on the back foot. So I live in an area that has a lot of cafes and restaurants, and they're all family-owned businesses, and they're completely destroyed by the current lockdown policies. And it doesn't seem to, when you speak to these business owners, the logic doesn't seem to stack up. So they're sitting there going, well, I can go to a park and work out next to as many people as I want, and that's apparently fine. I can go and line up for food at Coles and Woolies with hundreds of other people, and that's fine. But my licensed establishment that, is licensed for 200 people can't have 5 people or 10. I have to lock down everything and can only do deliveries. It's destroying these businesses, and you're looking at companies that are, potentially facing bankruptcy. So that's not to take away from the seriousness of the pandemic. We need to do the right thing, and we need to try and limit the spread. But there has to be a middle ground on this, and unfortunately, governments tend to be very ham-fisted. And then when it comes to monetary policy, they seem to be going down the route of just printing money and giving bailouts, when in reality they should just be getting out of the way, cutting as much regulations as possible, cutting payroll taxes and income taxes, and putting a pause on those sorts of things until we can get to the other side of things, and hopefully not introducing payroll taxes on the other side as well.
Authorities don't like to give up power. They have an enormous amount of power right now, whether it's economically, they know more about you than ever before. Do you think, in the goodness of their heart, once we get out of this crisis and move out of this tunnel, cross the bridge, do you think in their goodness they will give back all that power?
No. Look, there will be certain things that they just cannot realistically, politically keep their clutches onto. But I think any idea that once this is all over that we'll just wind back, that just won't happen. There's no such thing as a temporary tax. There's definitely no such thing as a temporary crackdown by governments in other areas. So, there's been discussions about something called a tracer app, and they're saying, oh, it won't be mandatory. It's all voluntary to download it. Well, that's what they're saying now. I wouldn't be surprised if at a later point they turn around and say, oh, not enough people are taking this app voluntarily, so now you must download it. It's seriously concerning, and it's one of these issues where we have to have some sort of frame of reference when it comes to handling this virus. I don't think we need to throw out some of our basic liberal democratic values in order to push against the spread of this virus.
It seems like some of the state governments, such as Victoria, which some are saying is the Socialist Republic of Victoria, it seems like that, but it does. It seems like they have this agenda. They're saying, "Wowee, it's presented itself to us. We can now control people more and more than we ever have." And that, to me, that the civil liberties stuff and the restriction of freedom, the information they have on everybody, it's, in my opinion, a great overreach.
Well, absolutely. I mean, some of going back to the Tracer app and some of the pushes to essentially track people's movements and track what they do. This is the My Health Record system on steroids, and it's a seriously concerning thing that, unfortunately, a lot of people in the Canberra Press Gallery, when this stuff was announced, they didn't even grill the Prime Minister about the details on that. They were too busy asking him about, the former Prime Minister's book during a pandemic. So there's been a pretty big disservice by some press gallery journalists in not highlighting some of the issues around this Tracer app, and we're slowly finding out more and more information. But you look down in Victoria under the Andrews government, and that state is effectively a police state right now. I have friends who are down in Melbourne that are just seeing it firsthand, and it's ridiculous, and it is a massive overreaction. But unfortunately, when it comes to times of great upheaval, you see this a lot. So for people that are concerned about it, you need to be willing to push back against it once we get to the other side of this pandemic.
It was a terrible couple of weeks. We had the COVID-19 really ramping up, and then we have Malcolm Turnbull's book. And I mean, I thought it couldn't get much worse, but his book came out and it really put things in perspective. There are things worse than COVID-19, and that's Malcolm Turnbull's book. So, so I don't know. Who knows?
It's one of those things where, it's been wall-to-wall media coverage of coronavirus, and you lose perspective that there are still things happening around the world. In Hong Kong, political dissent is being stifled out. There were 15 protest leaders that have been arrested and not heard from. There's been all kinds of moves by even the Chinese military and Navy pushing into disputed waters, but that's not really hitting media front pages because we're looking at coronavirus and a poorly written book by a pretty poor former Prime Minister.
Yeah, I think I'm not too sure if he's worse than the COVID-19, but it's pretty close, probably neck and neck at this stage. Hey, speaking of the shutdown.
More annoying.
Oh, dreadful. Speaking of the shutdown, do you think we should be out of this now?
At very least, I think we should be going to stage 2. So stage 2 is what we had before this full lockdown, where you could still go to your local establishment as long as there was some social distancing in place and all that kind of stuff. At the very least, I think we should be going to that. I don't know if you can go back to business as usual because we've seen what happens. I mean, look no further than New York. New York ignored the issue for a while. They had the mayor telling people to go to Chinatown and go to different areas in Manhattan and really celebrate nightlife and so forth. And now that city is completely destroyed. I think we have to be careful here. So it's one of the straw man arguments that's pushed by people who want lockdowns forever is that if you question it in any way, shape, or form, you don't care about the virus and you just want people to die. I also care about businesses being shut down. I would love to see the economy opened up entirely. I don't think that's probably feasible right now. But at the very least, why can't we go back to stage 2? We're looking at the case numbers. We know that we got ahead of this and that we've eased the burden on the health sector. ICU beds are not overflowing in this country as a result of that. Why can't we roll back just a little bit? There are restaurants and cafes just around where I live, and the owners are talking about shutting up shop completely because they don't have enough money to pay rent, let alone wages.
With all the money that's been handed out, and there's been just a pile of it, taxpayers are going to be in the gun post the virus. What's your greatest concern?
Other than some of the civil liberty issues that we discussed previously, just a massive amount of debt that Australians are going to have to pay back, and particularly young Australians. So people that have just got out of high school and they're starting in the workforce, people that have just finished university and they're starting in the workforce, people who are still at university and were doing hospitality jobs that no longer exist right now, so they're jobless. They're going to fall into either a welfare cycle or a poverty cycle. And then on the other side of this, if they do get a job, there's going to be close to $1 trillion worth of debt that they need to pay down. And it's going to really affect their long-term prosperity. And on top of that, how are we going to pay this back? I guarantee you the government's going to is going to have to try and increase revenue. They're not going to cut spending because we've seen that a lot of Liberal parties at a federal level are liberal in name only, and when it comes to cutting spending, they rarely do. So they're going to increase revenue. Now, maybe they won't increase income taxes because people at a political level feel that, but I guarantee you there'll be excises and there'll be levies and there'll be stamp duties and there'll be increases on capital gains and all those sorts of things. So those are the things I'm concerned about because it's the younger generations that will be paying this for years.
I find with excise, it's actually really interesting. I always drink a cheap whiskey because I'm probably cheap, but the cheap whiskey makes me feel better now because it's really expensive. So I don't drink it because it's in the expensive range. So I sit on my cheap bottle of wine, a glass a night, only a glass a night, and have some cheese, cheap cheese. And with excise on alcohol, I really don't want that wine becoming mineral water. I want to enjoy life a little bit.
Well, that's the thing. It's people always used to joke about Australia being a bit of a nanny state, and I used to say that too. But it's more of a revenue state where you're allowed to do things as long as the government finds a way to make money out of it. And that's something that we need to push back against, particularly on the other side of this when we're going to be in a bigger financial hole. We need to make sure that we don't accept ludicrous taxation levels and excises and levies. There are better ways to get out of this, and that's to get the government out of the way, ease restrictions, actually flatten taxes to allow businesses to prosper and hire more people and contribute to the economy in different ways. But we need to campaign on that, and we need to push that.
Brian, what's your greatest gripe about the ATO, and what is the most important reform that should occur?
It would probably actually just be the tax code in itself. And I don't want to get into too much of a detail around what the tax code looks like because I'll put all of your listeners to sleep. But it is so overly complicated. We know that when you look at countries like Singapore and Hong Kong that have much more effective tax rates that are pretty much flat, that businesses prosper and individuals prosper as a result of it. So the biggest gripe I have with the ATO is that everything that they do is deliberately so complicated that, sure, massive businesses with teams of accounting, with third-party accounting firms and their own teams of accountants, they can navigate through all those loopholes to do what they need to do to get tax breaks and incentives and all that kind of stuff, and that's great. But small and medium-sized businesses, they just can't. And they're the ones that are paying through the nose because of how complicated and broken the tax code here in Australia is. So my main gripe is that there's just a flat-out refusal to simplify it. There seems to be a flat-out refusal to push towards a flat tax rate or just even, break the brackets down to a much simpler system. And the people that are suffering as a result of it are your small and medium-sized businesses, which are the backbone of Australia's economy. Brian
Marlow, the Executive Director of the Australian Taxpayers Alliance, thank you very much. Have a great weekend. We must talk more often, and especially once we get post-COVID-19.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
We're talking business, nothing but talk.
This is the Coast Business Radio Podcast.